Good evening, everybody. Excited to be starting a new book with you tonight, the book of Joshua. And the man Joshua, we're going to be talking a lot about. But I'm going to say a point that maybe an opinion, I think I could probably prove it. I don't think Joshua is the most important person to learn about in the book of Joshua. Anybody guess who I would think or who might be the most important person? Rahab the harlot, yes. I think she's more important. She's more referenced in the New Testament than Joshua is. And we'll camp down on her story for about a day and consider that very hard. But I think she might be the most important person to know about from our study of the book. But there's a lot of important principles we're going to be talking about as we go through the book of Joshua. What is the book of Joshua all about? If you had to sum it up in just a couple of words, what would you say? Entering the land, that's a good one, yeah. I'd say conquering the land, overcoming the land, all the things that we want to do. Everything that the Israelites have been wandering for 40 years. We just finished that study, and now they're ready to go. And that's what the story of Joshua is all about. Well, if we're ready to go, let's go ahead and start off with a word of prayer. So would you bow your heads and pray with me? Holy God and Father in heaven, we come before you in prayer, and we give thanks to you, Father, that you have blessed us with the opportunity to gather together for a few minutes of time to study from your word. We pray, Father, the things we're going to be considering tonight, that they would be things that are profitable to us, that we might make ourselves more profitable as servants for you and your kingdom. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Why don't you get your Bibles and let's go over to the book of Exodus. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 17 for just a couple of moments, and we're going to jump around a little bit as we kind of talk just a few moments about the man Joshua, There's a lot of people in the Old Testament named Joshua, or variations of that name, as you might have seen as we started out tonight. There's a very important high priest named Joshua too. And of course, Jesus, his name is the name Joshua in the New Testament in Greek. So that's something that many people know as well. Joshua is identified as the son of Nun. He's the tribe of Ephraim. You know, Stephen made a real interesting comment to me tonight. Stephen, I hadn't really thought about it, but Stephen said, you know, it's interesting. There's nothing mentioned about Joshua's wife or children. They're never spoken of directly. Stephen says, he made the point to say the only indirect reference is when he talks about me and my household will obey the Lord. But it is interesting. I hadn't thought about that, Stephen, but I do think that that's an interesting tidbit for us to consider. We meet Joshua for the first time in Exodus chapter 17. So I'd like to ask somebody, if you would, can somebody read for us Exodus chapter 17, 5 verses here, verses 8 through 13. Can someone read Exodus 17, verses 8 through 13? Go ahead, Gregor. Thank you.
Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, "Choose us among men and go out and fight with Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him. And he sat on it, and Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword.
So this is our first reference to Joshua. Thank you very much. Our first reference to Joshua is Joshua leading a battle against the Amalekites. Don't know anything about him before this. Presumably, he's one of the slaves in Egypt. You would wonder what kind of slave was Joshua? What was his role? What did he do there? What prepared him that whenever they come out of Egypt, the first thing they do is assign him to this role? Well, that's very interesting, but we just don't know. Somebody had a comment? If not, I got a question for you. The first question tonight is this: what was Joshua's original name? His name gets altered in the course of his life. What was his name originally? Now, I'm kind of guessing originally. It's not as though we meet him in Exodus 17. So what would his name be originally? Who has it? Hoshea. George, who else had that name? Well, that was a dumb question for me, wasn't it? Who else had the name Hosea? Hosea, yeah. I was looking for Hosea the prophet is the same word. One other Hosea. And you can't just say Hosea. Who's the other Hosea? He was the king of Israel, one of the last kings of Israel. Here's the thing. I wish I knew more about Hebrew. They're all spelled in Hebrew the exact same way, but they're all written a little bit different. Hosea, Hosea, and a little bit of variation there. But as far as I can tell in Hebrew, they're the exact same names there. Now, whenever Joshua's name is changed, we don't know when it's changed, but the change kind of important. The word Hosea or Hoshea means salvation or deliverance. And his name becomes what? You add the J to the front. What does that do? Yeah, changes it to Jehovah is our salvation. So that's kind of the little tidbit there on that. Stan's got it too, as Hoshea, the son of Nun, is how he's identified there a little further on. When we first meet Joshua in the passage we just read, what's the duty that he has? What's his role? How would you describe it? General's a good one, yeah. Some kind of battle leader, and by the way, if this is a pretty good sized army, we would guess we saw an enumeration of 12,000 men, that would be a general. A general would be a brigadier commander at that level. So that would be an apt description. George, what were you going to do?
I was going to say the same thing, but in Exodus 24, he's also called Moses' assistant, depending on the translation, assistant, servant, minister.
That term assistant was interesting, isn't it? I can't remember if we actually read that or not here in a moment, but calling him Moses' assistant, kind of a neat little tidbit there too. I like that quite a bit. Anyone else? Stephen, go ahead.
He also seems to be a sort of guard at the temple gate. The temple entrance. The tent of meeting.
If we had to describe, it's interesting to talk about him as the guard at the temple or the tabernacle. One of the things to think about is he really is a very guarded person, or a person who's very, I don't want to go too far because I have a question about this in a moment, but that really aptly describes in some ways his personality too. We might come back to that here in just a moment, as well. I've got one more passage for us to look at. I need somebody to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 9 through 12. The very end of the book of Deuteronomy, or close to the end, Deuteronomy 34, verses 9 through 12. If somebody's got that, would you read that for me? Deuteronomy. Lamar, please.
Now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. For the children of Israel heeded him, and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But since then, there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel.
When I was looking over that passage, it occurred to me that what the passage there is describing is perhaps a contrast between Moses and Joshua. Now, by the way, a little interesting tidbit here too. A lot of people think, and it's as good a guess as any, that Joshua actually wrote that. That Joshua is the one that finished off Deuteronomy. And even some suppose that perhaps Joshua was the assistant scribe, if you would, kind of going back to what George read there about him being the assistant on the mountain, that he might have been the assistant to help write Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That he might have been the one that was helping to write all of these books. And that's very interesting to think about if that was the case. But what I find interesting is there seems to be a contrast here between these two men. And you see some things where they're similar and some things where they're very different. What ways are Moses and Joshua similar? What ways are they alike? You can go to this passage, or you can just throw something out in general. What ways are these two men alike? What do you have down? Go ahead. Right here it says they're both full of the spirit of wisdom. And that's a particularly interesting thing, especially since it talks about Moses having laid hands. So you get a sense almost to say it's the same spirit of wisdom. You wouldn't really question that anyway. But if you did, it's very particular to say they both have the same spirit of wisdom to that. What else do we have?
They were leaders.
They're both leaders. Yeah. They're both leaders of the people. And to some degree, what's interesting is, well, I'll tell you what, I won't say this yet. I might say this is a contrasting point, but let's hold on that and say, yeah, they're both leaders to the Israelites. Stephen?
They're both really zealous for God.
Yes, they're both very zealous for God. Stan puts down they're both obedient to God, that they both are men that have a great love for God. You know, we could say that too. Anybody else have another one? You know, it's interesting when you think of the character that these men have. You say, well, they're a lot alike. But this passage is also saying they're kind of different. Let me kind of go back to what Debbie said a second ago. What kind of leader was Moses? Was he excited to go? Very hesitant, very reluctant. But you don't see that with Joshua. You know, you don't really ever get a sense where Joshua is reluctant. And even in the first chapter and second chapter of Joshua, I'm going to say that Joshua probably has a lot of things to think about, but he never really seems reluctant. So it's very interesting. They're both leaders, but one of them seems like a reluctant leader, and one of them seems like a ready-to-go leader. By the way, it could be that they're roughly the same age. That and I don't mean like at the same time. I mean that when Moses was called to lead Israel, he was 80. Joshua may be coming close to 82 as well. You know, you can't calculate it, and I can't remember exactly, but he's close to that age too. So it's kind of interesting that they may, you know, have that in common, that they're both called about that time. What else is different about them? Like I said, maybe you see it in the passage, or maybe you see it in general. What else is different about them?
God spoke to Moses face to face.
Yes. By the way, I'm going to make a big deal out of this in a couple of classes. God talked to Moses face to face. The implication is, and by the way, God does kind of talk to Moses to Joshua face to face as the commander of the army of the Lord. But it seems a different conversation. The point of this passage is God talked to Moses differently than God talks to Joshua. And I want to kind of make a point, moving a little further on, that the significance is that the first thing God's going to tell Joshua is not to listen to me and I'll come tell you what to do. He's going to say, read the book that I gave you and it will tell you what to do. That's pretty different to think about. Stephen?
Something interesting about Joshua is he was the only one allowed on the mountain. Even the elders in Greece couldn't step on the mountain.
That's very interesting. You know, and like I said, it seems very interesting about Moses' position. It's not entirely clear that he went to the very top with Moses, but I will say I'm very confident Joshua went further than anyone else. No one else was allowed to go as far as he was, including the high priest. That's interesting to me too. So, and that might have something to do with being a co-scribe, you know, that he's writing some of these things down too. Be careful to say that's just me speculating a little bit, but again, it is interesting, and we'll ask a question about that here in a few moments. Anything else that are different about them? Go ahead.
This is the thing. God told Moses not to go back. In Joshua 1, he tells Joshua the same thing.
Yes, very interesting how God tells him the exact same thing, you know, of how to obey him. And that is actually very interesting. What else do you have? It said something about Moses before Pharaoh being something different than Joshua. What's the implication? Yeah, that Moses performed a lot more miracles than Joshua will. And it's not to say we won't see miracles with Joshua, but not like Moses, where Moses was performing. That's going to be kind of a different thing altogether. Joshua is, you know, by the way, that's kind of an important idea of the concept of miracles being kind of a part of a revelation. The point is that when Joshua was on the scene, the fullness of that law is supposed to be concluded. So the sense of miracles is changed as well. So one of the things it says here is the miracle. Excuse me, the miracles seem to have changed. Got a comment here from Stephen Root. Stephen says, perhaps he was made a general because of his readiness to go. Seems as he had to act without hesitation. Now that's an interesting observation, because that battle with the Amalekites was pretty spur of the moment, and you needed somebody to get right to it. And so it might be a characteristic of the difference between Joshua and Moses, that Joshua was a guy who, spur of the moment, you can go. Moses was a guy of, let's find somebody else. So that could be a part of that too. Stan makes the observation that Moses was very meek, and you know, Joshua, that terminology isn't used, although I wouldn't say he was to the opposite of that either, but it is interesting to consider that about Moses. Anybody have anything else? Go ahead, Stephen.
Two things. One, Joshua unhesitatingly immediately obeyed Moses. And I think he really loved Moses,
Mm.
the father. He just seems to be really zealous for God and for Moses.
You know, that is something very interesting. And I tell you what, Stephen, in just a couple of moments, I want to talk about something that happened between them that I think kind of makes that love or that, feelings towards him, I'll use the word zeal, that kind of key you into the verse I'm thinking of, that he has for him. We'll see in just a few moments. So very good point. Anybody else have something you want to throw out there about go ahead.
Well, it seems to me Joshua was more of a follower, but also, he was a leader, but he was willing to follow directions. Where Moses was a dealer. He often debated with God about things. He would try to convince, let's make a deal.
Mm-hmm.
And where I never hear Joshua making that deal.
Yeah.
Joshua's just, let's get her done. Just a different attitude.
I think the Bible would use the word mediator to describe what you're describing there, that Moses was a mediator, and you're saying we don't see that same characteristic with Joseph. Very, very interesting point. Anyone else? So let's just kind of talk about Joshua then. So what characteristics would you use to describe him? What are the things that you say, hey, Joshua is a man with, or a man that does this? What would you say are his characteristics? Faithful, good. Faithful, very good. Anything else? I was kind of thinking about him, and I thought, well, for one thing, he's got integrity. He seems to be a man that's committed to dedicated to the things of God. Courage. And what's kind of interesting, and Stan throws courage out there too. Courage is the one that I struck with, and how many times it's interesting. It's going to be mentioned in Joshua chapter 1 about have courage. But he seems to be very much a man of courage, and I think it's next week we'll talk a little bit about why would you tell a man of courage to have courage. Well, I think it's just something worth considering there too. Devoted. Now, this kind of comes back to something Stephen said just a moment ago about his devotion to God and to Moses. I was thinking of that, but maybe warrior, soldier. This is another one. Anybody have another term you throw out there if you were asked what Joshua is? Go ahead.
Except for a couple of cases, he was a good example.
Yeah, and those couple of cases, I want to come back to those here in just a moment to say what were his failings. To talk about that, but frankly, well, I won't talk about it yet. But yeah, he was a great example. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point. Anybody else? Debbie, go ahead.
He was both trusted and loyal. God could trust him to be and the people trusted him, but he was also loyal.
Yeah, loyal to whom though?
God.
Yeah, fundamentally to God. Even when he says, at the end of his life, you go your way, I'm going to go with the Lord. So his loyalty to the people was always within the scope of his loyalty to God. And I kind of think that's an important point to consider. Got a passage for us to think about here at the end of his life, that very point. Passage probably most of us are familiar with. It's interesting that so many, we have this in a plaque on our wall, and a lot of you do too, where Joshua is talking to the people at the end. He says, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers, which your fathers served, that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We love that statement. It's just a profound statement. And again, going back to what Debbie said, it speaks to the idea that Joshua is saying, even if you're going to be lost, I'm not going to be lost. Even if you choose to follow a path that's wrong, I won't follow that path. I'm going to stay dedicated to the Lord. That's a pretty profound declaration. Lots of times we're easily dragged aside when people that are important to us, or people that, are influential in our life, that they go astray. It's, we're kind of drawn into that sometimes. Here's Joshua, and he says, he loves the people, but he says, you know what, if you guys go wrong, I'm not following you. I'm going to stay faithful to God. And that's a really profound thing to think about. So I want to kind of go through a couple of the events that we have in the life of Joshua and say, what do these events tell us about him? And the first of these goes back to something that Stephen mentioned earlier. When he goes up to Mount Sinai with Moses, what does that indicate about him, or a characteristic about him, or something about him? What does it indicate? And Stephen made the point to say that he seems pretty uniquely, I always remember Mr. Hetzer got me on a trivia question on how many people went up on that mountain. And I lost because of him, because he tricked me. That's all there is to it, you know. But the point is that who went up to the top of the mountain? Well, ultimately, at the end, Moses alone, but the one that seems to have accompanied him the furthest is Joshua. But what does that tell you? What kind of things do you get out of that? To whom? To Moses and to God. I want to play on that for a second, that he's a faithful servant, that whatever Moses needs, Joshua is going to be there to provide. Maybe that's some sense of what we get out of that, but perhaps also we're seeing something about his dedication to God. What was everybody else thinking about the mountain at that time? Everybody else is looking at Mount Sinai saying, hey, this is a great party, great show. Well, they started building the calf pretty quick, right? But what was their first impression?
They were afraid.
They were terrified. So, by the way, this is a mountain. Why were they terrified? You remember? Thunder. Have you ever been on a mountain in a thunderstorm? How many of y'all been? I remember once we were out hiking and up in the top in New Mexico, and the clouds came in, and it starts to thunder. And let me tell you what, you don't want to be on a mountain in a thunderstorm. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that. So you see a thunderstorm going off on the top of the mountain. How many of you say, hey, let's go up to the top? Well, that's Joshua. So what do you get from there? Everybody else is terrified. Joshua goes. Well, I think it speaks a little bit to courage. At least the idea, and by the way, courage is going to be important. It's not the absence of fear, it's the presence of fear, but the desire to move forward regardless might be a point to consider there too. Go ahead.
Joshua was totally alone somewhere on the way up.
Yeah.
He doesn't have anybody to consult with.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, if Moses, like I said, it's kind of hard for me to picture exactly how this happens, but if Moses has gone on and he's like waiting all alone, he's waiting a long time all alone too. So, that really would be an impactful point. Gerald? And that's going to be important in my a couple of questions from now. This idea that he is a man who has a great deal of confidence in the Lord. Confidence in the Lord. So it's very powerful to consider how the people would have felt. Stan makes the point to say that people were afraid, he wasn't. Anybody else have something? Go ahead.
Well, it reminds me of another time when everyone else was afraid, and he and Caleb
Yes.
had confidence that,
Yes, and like I said, we'll come back to that one here in just a moment, because that's probably one of the biggest parts of his life, one of the biggest critical moments in his life where he made a decision that changed everything. It's a need. If I wrote a book on critical moments in history, that would be one. We'll come back to that here in a second. By the way, what else does this indicate about him if he was allowed to go up the mountain? Remember, what was everybody else told about the mountain? Don't touch it. I put my finger up to touch it. Don't touch it. But Moses was allowed, or I'm sorry, Joshua was also allowed. What does that tell you about Joshua?
I wondered if he had already been chosen as the next leader. God knew his heart, and maybe, I don't know, that was just a thought that crossed my mind.
It's very interesting that the people that have gone up are Moses, Aaron's sons, that will be the priests. Michael, help me out. Is it the 50, how many elders? The elders of Israel. I don't remember. I'm so happy you don't remember. That you can tell you how happy that makes me. You can't remember that. I can't remember. It was like 50 people total. That's what killed me in that question. But the elders of Israel, which are, kind of the people that are appointed as judges and such, and Joshua. And like I said, here's this illustrious host of people and Joshua. And I get a sense, Stan's got it. He says 70. So 70 elders then. So, this illustrious host and Joshua, I think of the ideas here, the idea of, Lisa makes a point to say, of trust, that he's trusting God to step on the mountain and not be struck down dead. That's actually pretty interesting to think of that. So that's an interesting point. Go ahead.
Well, just something to put in our minds is as we're reading this, he's showing faithful service to God. This is before everything, you start wondering. And then after he becomes the leader to go in and lead the conquest, there's another almost 20 years that he leads. So over his life, we're seeing a dedicated, faithful servant for 60, 70 years, at least.
You know what I think is interesting, Lamar, is Joshua transitions nicely from follower to leader. And I really think that's pretty great. That's a pretty interesting ability that maybe not everybody has, that he was a devoted follower and he was a devoted leader. And as you said, we don't always appreciate just how long a span of time we're talking about Joshua. But you mentioned 60 years, at least 60 years. Well, he's 110 when he dies. Like I said, he is at least, that period of time. So it really is interesting to think about that. So one other thing I would throw out there, do you have a number? Oh, no, okay. I still feel good. Sorry, I lament over here. One other thing to think about, though, is I would also suggest he's holy. That he was a person that could approach that mountain implies the idea that he was a person that was, personally dedicated to personal holiness. The idea of being a man that, didn't partake in the things of the world. In fact, he doesn't even know what's going on whenever they're out down there with the calf. Whenever he's saying, I don't know what I'm hearing, he can't even figure that. I like to think that implies the idea here's a man that is virtuous. Lisa makes a point to say he was called upon, and he could be, and to add to Lisa's point, he could be relied upon. He was trustworthy. Let's read another bit in his life. Stan actually had mentioned this in the chat here. It was the event of the book of Numbers whenever Moses and his spirit was passed upon the elders of Israel, and they all began prophesying. Now, do you remember there were two men out of the camp who started prophesying? And Joshua ran out there and saw this. He ran to Moses. He said, those guys out there are prophesying too. We need to rebuke them. What does that tell you about his character? Zealous. That's the word that we use here. He was zealous. When the Bible talks about people with zeal, Monique, when the Bible talks about people who are zealous, what kinds of people are there? Joshua is called zealous. Who else is called zealous in the book of Numbers? He said his zeal saved Israel. Phinehas, yes. How about Jesus? And he was eaten up with zeal for the house of God. That's pretty impressive. That's a pretty special thing to have. That's a characteristic that, we even talk about the Apostle Paul talk about his zeal for God. That idea of the zeal that he had, this, that I am burned with, maybe righteous indignation or, that I just can't let something stand by and be wrong. I have to do something about it. That's a pretty rare commodity, right? Even I'm bad about the fact that if something's gone wrong right in front of me, I'm dragging my foot if I have to get involved. But not Joshua. Joshua runs back and says, hey, those guys, we got to put a stop to that because that can't be good. By the way, what did Moses say? Moses didn't say, yeah, let's go stop them. Moses said, you know what I wish? Yeah, he says, I wish everybody was prophesying. It's not a bad thing. But, what's interesting is he says, are you zealous for my sake? Now, I think that's kind of neat because the implication is, almost I appreciate that you care that much about what I'm doing here. And that's how Joshua was. Joshua would have been a good friend to have. Let me just say that. Joshua would have been the kind of guy that I would have liked to have had as my friend because he really seems like a guy that really jumped up whenever the occasion came. Again, that concept of being dependable is important. Let's talk about one more point. Lindsay already brought it up. Let's kind of fish into this. The critical moment of his life, the biggest thing about his life is that he's selected as one of the spies. He comes back and gives his report. You remember his report? Well, first of all, is his report different than everybody else's? Linda's saying no, and you're right, Linda. His report was the same. It's the same land, there's tough things, but what was his conclusion? Yeah, he says, we shouldn't have a problem taking it if the Lord's with us. Now, what becomes even more important is that when the other spies say, oh, we can never do it. I mean, same report, but they say, oh, we can never do it. What did Joshua and Caleb jump up and say? Remember? Do they say, oh, well, you know, if you guys are, you know, you guys are okay with going back, we'll go back. What do they say? Yeah, they said, we can take it. And they said, if you turn around, you'll be sinning against God. And everybody said, you're right, Joshua, we're listening. What did they do? The Bible says they started to look for a way to kill them. You know, that's how much it was for him to stand up. It's a rare thing for somebody to stand up against a crowd of people that are against him. That's hard. Like I said, I don't know that I have that kind of courage, but Joshua does. What else would you describe characteristic-wise about this moment in his life? What else does this tell you about who he is? What do you think about the fact that they're looking at the land, all the other spies, they're not lying, they're saying, looking at this land, well, we couldn't take this land. You know what, they only suggest this, they couldn't take the land. But why did Joshua say they could? Like Linda said, let's go. Why did Joshua say, no problem? Faith. Fundamentally, Joshua has so much faith, it doesn't even seem to occur to him that if you didn't have faith, this looks pretty unbeatable. And that's an interesting thing. Stan throws it out there, belief in the power of God. His concept of his belief in God was so certain that it doesn't even seem like it ever occurred to him that this might be a bad idea. But from the worldly perspective, a whole group of refugees trying to take over a land where there's giants and there are fortified cities and all these different things, that sounds outrageously bad. It didn't even occur to Joshua because he was a man of such faith that he just said, well, God said he's going to do it, so let's go. There's no question in Joshua. Joshua doesn't seem to have any debate. Let's just go. Let's just take it. You know, God is with us. That's the kind of faith I'd like to have. That when I put my trust in God, I don't even question that it's going to work the way God said it would. That's tough. I don't have that. I want to, though. And Joshua's the guy I'm going to learn that from. I think that's an important point. Anybody else that you want to throw something else about Joshua from here? So let's then ask this. Here's a question, and this is kind of a trick question or a tricky question. What are the sins that Joshua committed in his life that you can remember? What do you remember? George?
Was the obvious one of the Gibeonites.
The Gibeonites. Now, here's what's interesting about the Gibeonites. We're going to read about the story of the Gibeonites who tricked Joshua. And Joshua is told, you should have talked to God before you made this decision. But here's where it's kind of a trick question. Does God hold that as a sin? Anybody have a thought? Doesn't seem. Yeah, it doesn't punish him. Doesn't punish him. In fact, he punishes the Gibeonites. He says, okay, they're they can be your slave, more or less. Yeah, they lied. He does rebuke him, but it's kind of questionable as to whether it's a sin. So what else do we got? It's okay that you're quiet. Or George, go ahead.
After the battle of Ai, he basically accused God of some things based on his assumptions, which were wrong.
That's an interesting point, too, where he's upset and he thinks God let him down. And what does God reveal to him? Yeah, the people had let God down. Now, again, does God punish Joshua? And again, it's kind of dubious. Now, those are the only two I can think of, George. Do you have any others? And they're questionable as being sin. I want to be careful to say, I'm not going to tell you Joshua was sinless. But I am going to say that the Bible is very clear to reveal about people their glaring faults all the time. Joshua doesn't have much. Now, I think some of that is because Joshua's kind of a mirror of Christ. And so perhaps to some degree, obviously, he sinned in his life. We all sin, fall short of the glory of God. But perhaps one of the things that we want to consider here is the idea of how it is the case that Joshua really was a pretty virtuous man. Now, by contrast, what did Moses' sins look like? Well, what's the big one we just studied? What did he do? Yeah, he hit the rock. What else did he do? Where God was going to kill him. Didn't circumcise his children. And God was actually going to strike him down and kill him for that. We got Moses' faults. We got his failings, and, where God held him accountable for some things. Just kind of an interesting contrast. Like I said, I want to be careful. I don't want to imply or say that Joshua was without sin. But the Bible wants us to get a sense of a man that really tried to live a very virtuous life. And the times that he will stumble, like I said, it's things that we might understand weren't entirely disobedience, but instead characteristics of being weak or being, not fully investigating or things like that. That's what we'll be kind of looking at as we consider this. Got one more passage for you to look at here. Numbers chapter 27, verses 18, 19, and 20. The Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. Inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient." As we consider this statement here, at the end of time, you see Eleazar the priest. That indicates that this is, of course, after Aaron has died. This is right at the end of the 40 years. And God says, here's what you need to do. You need to take Joshua. And Joshua is already a man of the Spirit. And you're going to lay your hands on him. And that's kind of an interesting statement that we saw there in Deuteronomy as well. You're going to lay your hand on him. And you're going to do this in front of everybody so that everybody sees that he's the one. And that's kind of how Deuteronomy ends. Deuteronomy ends the life of Moses. And it wraps up quite literally with the death of Moses. And Joshua begins with Joshua as the leader of Israel. And that's a really great place for us to consider. Now, got a question for you. I need somebody to read for me Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 28. Somebody go over to Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 28. I want you to read that passage out loud for us. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 28. I missed a comment in our chat. Sorry about that, Stephen. Stephen is talking about his place with the Israelites being a spy. And Stephen made the comment that he knew the promise of God and he knew God keeps his covenants. And that really is a neat point. Stephen, sorry I missed your comment earlier. Who's got that passage for me? Thank you, Michael.
But charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him. You shall go across at the head of this people. You will give them as an inheritance the land which you will see.
What did God command Moses to do there? What's the command?
My idea was that he's commanding Moses to train Joshua to take over after he's gone.
It's kind of interesting the way he puts it there as he starts off. And there in chapter 3, he says to charge him. In chapter 1, he says to build him up, to encourage him. I was thinking about that, and I thought, that's really kind of an interesting thing, that maybe that's a point to think about what good leaders do. Good leaders build up the next good leaders, that they're mindful of the things that are to come. And I thought, that's kind of a neat way to think of this. But I think it's important for us to understand that Joshua, for his experience, for his age, he's not young, at least by our standard for sure. He's not a young guy. For the things he's accomplished, he still needs some encouragement. A man in his 60s, 70s, 80s, he still needs some encouragement. He still needs somebody to kind of boost him up. And God's telling Moses, you got to encourage him. You got to get him ready to go to do this. But I think that's important. I think it tells us that even the people that we think are the greatest leaders around, they might need encouragement. They might need to be boosted up. People that have been, that are experienced at life, that's a nice way of saying older, experienced at life, still need encouragement, still need to be boosted up. I think this is just something important for us to consider. Bring me to my last question. Question I think is the one that I've thought about the most. What do you think it felt like if you're Joshua and you are taking over for Moses? So let me grab one comment here for a second. Stan makes the statement that Moses was to encourage him and strengthen him because he'll be the leader of the people. What do you think it's like if you're Joshua And you're replacing a man who talked to God face to face. And that's not your relationship with God. You're replacing a man who was a prince of Egypt. So he's very, sophisticated. He's very educated. You were a slave in Egypt. He was a prince. You're replacing a man that had for 40 years led everybody. What do you think it feels like to be Joshua in that moment? What do you think? Go ahead, Moni. Isn't that the term we always use? He's got some big shoes to fill. It's a great term that gives the sense of, I've got to do that and I'm not that. Lamar?
The leadership that Moses did, that God wanted him to do, it's somewhat different than what Joshua did. Joshua was going to lead people in to conquer the land. Moses was to bring the people to the land. So a little bit different roles. It would be big shoes to fill, and there's a lot of responsibility. But different aspects of what's needed at the time, and God raised up particular needs for that task.
Lamar, I love this comment. If you heard what Lamar said, two different kinds of leadership. And what's really neat, Lamar, we could play with that a little bit to say Moses needed to be a mediator to bring forth the covenant. Joshua needed to be a warrior and lead people to battle. It's interesting that Moses was never the man that led them into battle, or very seldom. It's always Joshua. And it's very interesting to say they did need two different kinds of leaders. That's a really important point. Lisa throws out a comment. Lisa says, you might think he's blessed and honored. And I'm ashamed to say I just saw the negative, but it might be a real honor to be selected that. She also throws out intimidating, and that's all I could think about. I'd be terrified to follow after that. If I were a preacher and I came in a congregation and they said, oh, by the way, the last preacher, he baptized 50 people a week, and boy, when he preached, we'd all just stand up because we couldn't get enough of that. Boy, I think I'm going to go to the next church down because I don't want to be here. That'd be really hard. And that's exactly what Joshua has to do. He has to step into a position where the guy before him talked to God face to face. Go ahead.
I was just thinking, going back to something else we talked about, that it seems that Joshua may have been a leader in training because he was however far. And he talked to the Amalekites, and these were all things that happened well before this event here. So he's actually sort of training for it in a sense.
That's a really neat point, Stephen. The idea that, and by the way, I would suggest to you that Moses has been training him for this, that Moses has been training him for a leadership position, that Moses has been giving him responsibility of things to take care of. And I think that's important. Lisa makes an interesting comment here. She says, from what we've learned about him tonight, in other words, about his, trust in God, he might have been intimidated, but perhaps he knew that he would succeed if he obeyed God. That's actually a really neat observation. That again might speak to the idea of he might have been scared, and I think chapter 1, chapter 2 might bear a little bit of that out, but he's also a man that trusts God. Stephen makes the statement, Stephen Root says his outlook, it would seem to me his ideology would be that with God all things are possible. Not that it would be easy. Now, I like that. I like that a lot. That's going to be one of the themes we walk through, is the idea that God may be bringing us victory, but we have to work for it. That's an important point to think about. Stan makes the statement, he knew God had given Joshua the best teacher. So there's that point as well. We're just about at our time. I want to say, what do I expect to get from Joshua? I'm on this journey with you. What am I looking forward to get? Well, number one, I want to learn a little more about what it is to be a leader before God, whether it's a leader in my home, a leader, with the church, the community, whatever it might be. There's a lot of characteristics that are really important, things that we need to have if we're going to stand up and make a difference. If we're going to have those critical moments like Joshua did, I'd sure like to learn from Joshua how to be the kind of person that makes a difference. And Joshua's the kind of person that makes a difference. That's something. Number two, I'd like to know how Joshua personally did it. That Joshua doesn't seem to be succumb to the temptations that the world offers, that all the Israelites had around him. He doesn't seem drawn into that. I'd sure like to know a little more about that. And then finally, in general, Book of Joshua's got a lot about spiritual warfare, some of the most important ideas about spiritual warfare, about working with God, we'll talk about having sin in the camp and the things that disable us from victory. These are important ideas that the book of Joshua tells us all about. And we'll stop here. We're at our time. Appreciate our comments online. Appreciate everybody's thoughts tonight. Next week, we're going to pick up, read Joshua chapter 1. I imagine we'll probably spend a lot of our class actually reading through some of that too, as we kind of get ourselves familiar with Joshua's commission, some things he has to say to the Reubenites and the Gadites, and some things they have to say to him that are kind of interesting too. So thanks so much for all the comments.